3 very creepy. Spent a night with ghost horror stories. The sea that night was feral. The waves crashed violently against the jagged cliffs, each impact rattling the air like thunder. The wind roared relentless, as if warning me, urging me to turn back. It carried the sharp tang of salt. And something else, something unplaceable but undeniably wrong. I stood motionless at the base of Blackwater Lighthouse, its dark silhouette looming against the turbulent sky. The light at the top had been extinguished for decades. Some called it an act of preservation. The locals called it a curse. I didn't believe in curses, not really. But as a writer who thrived on the eerie and unexplained, I couldn't resist the stories. Ghostly lights, disembodied cries, the kind of tales that made your skin crawl. Spending a night here wasn't just research, it was a challenge. Mr. Grayson, the lighthouse's grizzled caretaker, clearly thought I was insane. He'd hesitated before handing me the keys, his rough hands trembling ever so slightly. His eyes, sharp, knowing, locked on mine. "I'm telling you, miss," he said in that gravelly tone. "This place holds on to things, memories, regrets. It doesn't let them go." His words lingered like a shadow as I drove to the lighthouse. But I dismissed them. I had to. By the time I arrived, the storm had reached its full fury. Rain pelted my windshield in sheets and the ocean roared, its voice almost drowning out my thoughts. I stepped out into the cold wind, my coat no match for the chill that seemed to cut straight to my bones. The lighthouse stood tall and unyielding, its iron door groaning loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick, heavy. It carried the scent of salt, damp wood, and something metallic. The beam of my flashlight swept over the peeling walls, the rusted railings, and the spiraling staircase. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the distant echoes of the storm. I climbed to the keeper's quarters, my footsteps hollow on the steps. The room was sparse, an iron bed frame, a weathered desk, and a single window overlooking the raging sea. I tried to shake off the creeping unease. "It's just a storm," I told myself. "Just the isolation, nothing more." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Midnight crept in slowly, the hours dragging like a heavy weight. I sat at the desk, scribbling notes about the oppressive atmosphere, the suffocating quiet. The old oil lamp I'd brought flickered weakly, casting strange, jittery shadows across the walls. And then, it started. A knock. Faint at first, just barely audible over the wind. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. Knock. Again, louder this time. I stood, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. My voice quivered as I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Nothing. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came again, echoing down the staircase, followed by a low, mournful wail. My breath caught. Was it the wind? I descended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. When I reached the ground floor, I saw it. The iron door, still shut. Relief swept over me, until I turned to head back upstairs. That's when I saw it, the lantern room. A pale, flickering light pulsed at the top of the lighthouse, casting eerie shadows down the spiral staircase. My stomach tightened. I knew the lantern hadn't worked in years. But there it was. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to abandon this foolish idea and run. But I couldn't. Something, curiosity, maybe madness, drove me to climb. Each step felt heavier, the air colder with every turn. By the time I reached the top, my breath came in short, shaky gasps. The lantern room was empty. The massive Fresnel lens stood in the center, a silent monument to its history. But the light was gone. And yet, I wasn't alone. A figure stood by the window, staring out at the raging sea. My heart thudded painfully as I took a step closer. The figure was a man, his uniform unmistakable. An old lighthouse keeper's attire, weathered and soaked as if he'd just stepped in from the storm. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't move. His hands gripped the windowsill, his posture stiff. When he spoke, his voice was low, hollow, carrying a sorrow that chilled me to the core. "They didn't see it," he murmured. "The rocks, the storm, they never saw it coming." My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" Slowly he turned, and I wished he hadn't. His face, Wacken, was pale, translucent. His eyes were hollow voids, dark and endless. "I tried to warn them," he said, his voice cracking with despair. "But the light was gone. They were doomed, just as I was." Before I could respond, the room was consumed by sound, a cacophony of screams, the violent crash of waves, and the groaning of wood splintering. And then, I wasn't in the lighthouse anymore. I was on a ship. Rain pelted the deck as sailors shouted, their faces etched with panic. The ship careened toward jagged rocks, the sea roaring like a predator about to claim its prey. I felt their terror, their helplessness as the inevitable loomed closer. And then, impact. The ship shattered. Screams dissolved into silence. I gasped, finding myself back in the lantern room. The keeper was gone, the light extinguished. The silence was deafening. I stumbled down the staircase, my legs trembling. I didn't look back. I couldn't. By dawn, I'd left the lighthouse behind. Even now, as I write this, I can still hear the echoes of that night. The keeper's sorrowful voice, the sailors' desperate cries. Some places are not meant to be revisited. Some stories are better left untold. And Blackwater Lighthouse, it watches, its secrets sealed behind rusted doors and shadowed walls. But for those who dare to listen, it still whispers. This is most scary. Spent a night with Ghost Horror Story number 2. There's something unsettling about places forgotten by time. It's not just their appearance. It's the weight they carry, an invisible heaviness that clings to the air. It wraps around you, burrows into your chest, and whispers, "Leave." That's exactly how I felt the moment I stepped into Fort Willow Creek. The locals had warned me. Over and over they warned me. Their stories were filled with dread, ghostly whispers, shadowy figures, strange, unexplainable sounds. But I didn't believe them. I dismissed their words as superstitions meant to keep curious outsiders away. I should have listened. Armed with a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and my sleeping bag, I set out to prove them wrong. The old fort sat on the edge of a dark, sprawling forest. Its crumbling stone walls were barely visible under the dim light of a waxing moon. As I crossed the creaky wooden bridge leading inside, a chill ran down my spine. The air was unnaturally cold for an autumn night. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the way the cold lingered, like unseen eyes were watching. Every breath I exhaled was visible, a cloud of mist against the blackness. "This is fine," I muttered to myself, the sound of my voice weak and hollow in the oppressive silence. Inside the fort, it was deathly quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you, amplifying every little sound. Each step I took echoed like a gunshot. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating broken furniture and rusted weapons scattered across the floor, remnants of a life long abandoned. I chose what I assumed was the main hall to set up for the night. The roof had caved in long ago, leaving the night sky visible above. The jagged edges of the stone walls cast eerie shadows that seemed to dance and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to keep busy, jotting notes in my journal, sipping coffee to ward off the chill, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. My skin prickled. My stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. Heavy boots on stone. My pen froze mid-word. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, the beam trembling as it illuminated nothing but cold, empty shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. My pulse thundered in my ears. I was just starting to convince myself I'd imagined it when I heard something else. A voice, low, gravelly, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. It echoed faintly, as though coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who goes there?" Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. but my legs felt like lead. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to respond. "I'm just passing through," I stammered. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching into eternity. And then, from the shadows, he stepped forward. A man. No, not a man. A figure. His uniform was tattered, his face pale and sunken, his eyes hollow and haunted. There was an otherworldly glow about him, faint but unmistakable. He wasn't alive. I knew that instantly. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice laced with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was closing. Finally, I managed to croak, Who are you?" "Lieutenant Daniel Harris," he replied. "I commanded this fort once." "What happened here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. His expression darkened. "The war ended, but we were forgotten, left behind. No supplies, no reinforcements, just silence." His voice cracked, filled with bitterness. One by one, my men fell. Hunger, despair, death claimed them all. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "And you?" His gaze locked with mine, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something. Regret? Pain? "I stayed," he said simply. "I couldn't leave. I swore an oath to protect this fort, even in death." The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the broken walls and extinguishing my flashlight. Panic surged as I fumbled to turn it back on. When the light flickered to life, the lieutenant was gone. But the air had changed. It was heavier now, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could feel. Then I heard it again. Whispers. Low, mournful murmurs. They were coming from the courtyard. Heart pounding, I stepped outside. What I saw froze me in place. Dozens of spectral figures stood in formation. Soldiers, all of them. Their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes empty. Yet they stood tall, their ghostly forms glowing faintly in the moonlight. At the front of the formation was Lieutenant Harris. His expression was grim, his voice filled with sorrow as he spoke. "These are my men, bound here as I am, trapped by our oaths, by the promises we made." I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Is there a way to help you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. His gaze softened, and for the first time I thought I saw a flicker of hope in his hollow eyes. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "if someone were to carry our story beyond these walls, if the world knew we weren't cowards, but men who were abandoned, perhaps then we could rest." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My throat tightened. My chest ached. "I'll do it," I said, surprising even myself. "I'll tell your story." The ghostly soldiers began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night like mist. The last to go was Lieutenant Harris. Before he disappeared, he gave me a faint, weary smile. The oppressive weight that had filled the fort lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. I stood there alone in the empty courtyard, the echoes of their voices still ringing in my ears. When I finally left, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I crossed the bridge, casting one last glance back at the fort. It stood silent and empty, but I could still feel their presence lingering, a quiet reminder of the promises they had kept. I've kept my promise. I've told their story. But even now, as I write these words, I can still hear the faint echo of boots on stone. And sometimes late at night, I wake to the sound of whispers that remind me of the night I spent with the forgotten soldiers of Fort Willow Creek. This is very scariest. Spent a night with Ghost Horror Story number 3. It all started as a dare, nothing more than a harmless challenge between friends. But looking back, I can't help but wonder if I should have listened to that nagging feeling deep inside me. You see, Silver Hollow Manor wasn't just any abandoned house. Everyone in town knew its dark history. Stories of strange disappearances, unexplained fires, and rumors of restless spirits who roamed its halls. They said you could hear strange sounds coming from within. Whispers, footsteps, things that just didn't belong. But no one dared to go near it. Until I did. My friends, always eager for a thrill, pushed me into it. The $100 bill Caleb waved in front of my face didn't help. That taunting look in his eyes pushed me over the edge. "You can't back out now," he said with that grin. The kind that said, if I turned tail, I'd be a coward. So that night, I found myself standing at the gates of Silver Hollow. The air was thick with mist, and the wind whispered in eerie tones, as if the house itself was beckoning me inside. It felt wrong, but my pride wouldn't let me back down. The gates groaned when I pushed them open, their rusted hinges protesting as they creaked. The manor loomed ahead of me, dark and imposing. It seemed alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the broken windows and crumbling facade, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the yard. A cold, unsettling shiver ran through me, but I shrugged it off. I took a deep breath and walked up the path. The crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound in the silence of the night. The manor seemed so still, like it had been waiting for me, waiting for someone. I pushed open the front door, its ancient wood groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The scent of mildew hit me instantly, cloying and thick. Dust swirled in the air, and the darkness pressed in around me like a heavy blanket. The air was heavy. It was so quiet. Too quiet. My footsteps echoed through the hall as I made my way into the parlor, heart hammering in my chest. This was supposed to be a joke, right? But something felt wrong. Something was off. I spread my sleeping bag out on the floor, trying to ignore the sinking feeling gnawing at me. I figured I'd just wait it out, stay awake, and leave before anything too strange happened. But then the silence. It was so oppressive. Every little sound seemed to reverberate, amplified. The faint creak of the house settling, the whisper of the wind through the trees. My own breath felt too loud. And then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft thud, almost like footsteps coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one here. I was alone. Or so I thought. I stood frozen, staring up the staircase, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps were slow, measured. It wasn't the sound of someone in a hurry. This was deliberate, like someone waiting for me to respond. A bead of sweat ran down my temple. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice came out shaky, weak. No response. I waited, but the footsteps didn't stop. I had to know. I had to see. With shaky hands, I grabbed my flashlight and ascended the staircase. Each step I took seemed to creak under my weight, the sound too loud in the stillness. The hall upstairs was dark, almost suffocating in its silence. There were rooms on either side, all the doors slightly ajar, as if the house had been waiting for me. I picked the first one on the left and carefully opened the door. The room was a bedroom, nothing special, but something caught my eye. The mirror on the dresser. I froze. A small handprint, smudged on the glass. It was child-sized, but the fingers, they were too long, too thin, like they didn't belong. And the imprint, it was too fresh. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, a chill deeper than the air around me. And then came the humming, a soft, almost melodic sound, like the lullaby of a child. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt like it was coming from all around me. I turned quickly, my flashlight flickering in my hands. I couldn't see where it was coming from. I felt trapped. And then, as if the house itself had been waiting for me to make the next move. The humming grew louder. I turned and walked back toward the hallway. I felt the air grow colder with every step I took. The door to the next room on the right was slightly ajar, and the humming was coming from within. I pushed it open, and that's when I saw it. A rocking chair. It was slowly rocking back and forth, though there was no one there to move it. The sound of the humming stopped. I was standing still, trying to make sense of it when... Bang! The door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, flashlight raised. Nothing. But the rocking chair had stopped. And then, in the silence that followed, my heart pounded so loud I could hear nothing else. The chair moved. Slowly, impossibly, it rocked forward, as if someone unseen had just let it go. And then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps growing louder, closer. I ran, I didn't even think. I bolted for the stairs, but as I reached the bottom, the parlor was different. The fireplace, which had been empty when I left, was now alive with fire. My sleeping bag was now neatly laid out in the middle of the room, like someone had prepared it for me. A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. The laughter. A soft giggle. At first it was gentle, like a child's laugh, almost playful. But then it grew, and it wasn't playful anymore. It was cold. I spun around, looking for the source, but I saw nothing. My flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't just footsteps. It was like something, or someone, was moving toward me step by step. I turned to face it, and that's when I saw her. A little girl standing in the corner of the room. Her face was hidden by matted hair, but her eyes, those eyes, were dark and endless, like black pits that stared right through me. I backed away slowly, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. She raised a finger and pointed toward the staircase. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag and bolted toward the door, but just as I reached for the handle, I felt it. A cold hand, small, icy, gripped my sleeve. I looked down, but there was nothing there. The house was reaching for me. I didn't stop running until I was out in the yard, gasping for breath. The chill of the night air never felt so welcoming. I glanced back at the manor. The windows were dark, silent, nothing moved. But from the upstairs window, a faint light flickered. And for just a moment, I saw her standing there, staring at me, watching. And I knew. I wasn't meant to leave. But somehow I did. I haven't been back since. And I don't think I ever will. But on nights when the wind howls through the trees, I hear the faintest echo of laughter. And I wonder if Silver Hollow Manor is waiting for the next soul to stay. Forever.